Most drivers treat engine oil like bottled water. Grab whatever's on sale, glance at the number on the bottle, dump it in the crankcase, slam the hood, done. They walk away convinced they did the job right because they followed what the manual told them. I wish it was that simple, but I took 3 engines off the same block, same tight tolerances, same test conditions, and I filled each one with a different oil. A thin 0W-20 that pours almost like water, a middle-of-the-road 5W-30, and a heavy 5W-40 that actually has body to it. Then I ran all 3 through the same kind of hell. Cold starts after sitting in a freezing garage overnight. Simulated city traffic with constant stop and go. Highway pulls at sustained high RPM for hours, and I repeated that cycle until the metal itself started telling the story. It didn't take years to see the difference. It showed up fast. Faster than anyone in the shop expected. And one of those 3 oils quietly caused a very specific type of damage that the owner of the vehicle would never notice until an $8,000 repair bill landed in his lap. I'm going to show you exactly what I saw. But here's the thing, there's something I found in this teardown that kills more engines than any of the 3 oils I tested. And it's not the one you think. I'm going to save that for the end. Let's start where engines suffer the worst damage of their lives. The cold start. When you shut the car off at night and walk into your house, gravity gets to work. The oil that was lubricating your cylinder head, your camshafts, your timing chain, none of it stays magically suspended in the metal. It drains. Slowly, over the course of 12 hours, every drop runs back down into the oil pan. In the morning, when you twist the key, the metal up top is dry, bone dry. You've probably been told that the oil weight printed on your yellow filler cap is always the safest bet. That's not entirely true, because when I took 3 different viscosities and ran them through the same engine platform, one of them quietly destroyed parts that the driver would never have heard complain. The standard reasoning is too simple. Thinner oil saves fuel because it flows easier. Thicker oil protects more because it leaves a heavier film. Pour it in, close the hood, forget about it. But that logic breaks down the second your tires hit the road, because your engine doesn't operate in one stable condition. It jumps between violent extremes. Frozen morning starts, brutal thermal stress when you punch onto an interstate on ramp, heavy load sitting in city traffic, and the wrong oil doesn't blow your motor up in an afternoon. It grinds the block down in silence, year after year, without ever lighting up a single warning on your dash. A lot of guys think that little rubber anti-drainback valve inside the oil filter handles this. It helps. It keeps the filter housing primed so the pump doesn't suck air on startup, but it does absolutely nothing to stop the oil from running off the bearings and the cylinder walls during the night. The metal is still exposed, and this is where the physics of viscosity decides if your engine lives or dies. When the starter forces the crankshaft to spin, the oil pump down in the pan has to grab that cold fluid and shove it all the way up to the cylinder head. Modern engines aren't loose old V8s from the 90s. The clearances between the rotating parts are microscopic, gaps thinner than a sheet of notebook paper. When you try to force a thick fluid through a passage like that with the metal frozen, the system fights itself. Here's what I saw when I tore down the 3 blocks. 0W-20 moved almost instantly. It has the consistency of water when it's cold. The pump grabbed it and pushed it through the tight galleries with no resistance. It reached the camshaft in a fraction of a second. Metal-on-metal contact was minimized. The 5W-40 lagged. Every cold start, the thick oil struggled to push through the tight clearances. The pump had to overcome the resistance of the fluid itself. If you've ever cranked an old pickup on a winter morning and heard that aggressive metallic tick coming from the top of the engine for about 3 seconds before it went quiet, you've already heard boundary lubrication. That noise is metal scraping on metal. The protective liquid wedge doesn't exist yet. You're shaving microscopic particles of steel off your camshaft lobes. Sounds like nothing. You're thinking it's just 1 or 2 seconds before the oil pressure gauge sweeps up. But do the math on your actual life. You cold start every morning to go to work. Again leaving the office. Again leaving the grocery store. Over 3 years, you subjected those bearings to thousands of dry starts. That extra second of thick oil refusing to climb adds up. You're grinding the soft aluminum of the bearings against the steel of the crankshaft while they wait for the fluid to arrive. Thinner oil reaches the valve train faster. It dramatically reduces the wear that happens at the exact moment the engine fires. At this point in the story, the 0W-20 looks like the undisputed champion. Flows fast, gets to the metal on time, kills the dry start damage. But that's half the story, and this is where it gets weird. You roll out of the neighborhood, hit the freeway, put a sustained load on the engine. The metal gets violently hot, and that thin oil that was an advantage stops being an advantage. It becomes a liability. Once the block is fully hot, every rule I just walked you through inverts. You drive 15 minutes, glance at the gauge cluster, see the temp needle sitting dead center. You assume everything's fine down there. That gauge is lying to you. That's only the temperature of your engine coolant. Inside the block, the oil is running much hotter. When you put sustained load on the motor, like merging onto an interstate at 75 or passing a semi on a grade, the internal temperatures spike. The oil in the pan might be sitting at 220, but the oil being forced through the main bearings or splashing against the bottom of the pistons is easily hitting 300 Fahrenheit, and heat is the enemy of viscosity. When I pushed the test engines to that thermal limit, the physical reality showed up. I hooked mechanical pressure gauges directly to the block. Didn't trust the digital sensors that feed your dashboard. I wanted raw numbers. As the engine running 0W-20 got hotter and sat at sustained highway speed, the pressure started dropping. It wasn't an instant collapse that would make you pull onto the shoulder. It was a slow, steady sag. The oil got so hot it lost its internal stability. And because it was already thin to begin with, the pump couldn't hold pressure anymore. At the same time the pressure dropped, the engine got louder. I used a mechanic's stethoscope right on the valve cover with the motor running under load. The engine running 0W-20 sounded different after an hour of stress. The valve train tick got sharper. The hydraulic lifters were going soft, because the hot thin oil was bleeding right out of them. The protective wedge had vanished, and the metal parts were dangerously close to touching. The 5W-30 stayed consistent. Pressure barely moved from cold to hot. Valve train sounded uniform. And the block with 5W-40 didn't even flinch. Didn't care about the heat. It acted like a shock absorber between the rotating parts. The unavoidable truth of internal combustion is that heat thins oil. If you start with a fluid that's already paper thin out of the bottle, and then you subject it to a localized hotspot inside the block, it can get too thin to do its job. And that exact moment is when your protection collapses. I see the consequence of this in my bay constantly. Let me tell you about a guy who thought he was doing everything right. I'll call him Lucas. Lucas bought a Japanese sedan brand new. He was proud of it. Opened the glove box, read the manual, saw the printed requirement for 0W-20 synthetic. He followed it religiously, never missed an oil change, used the brand the dealer recommended. But Lucas had a specific usage profile. He was a long-distance commuter, 80 miles a day on open highway. Wasn't the guy cruising in the right lane. He lived in the left lane, high RPM, passing constantly, putting sustained thermal stress on a 4-cylinder, 75,000 miles, which is nothing for a modern Japanese block. The car started doing something terrifying. It started drinking oil. He showed up at my shop rattled because the low-level light flashed at him on a highway exit ramp. I pulled the dipstick and it was dry, almost 2 quarts low. I put the car on the lift, pulled the belly pans, grabbed a flashlight. We spent an hour looking. No leaks. Pan dry. Valve cover gasket perfect. Tailpipe wasn't blowing blue smoke. The engine was just quietly burning its own lubricant. Here's what happened. Because Lucas pushed the car hard on the highway every day, the 0W-20 was getting sheared. It was breaking down under sustained high RPM load. The film lost its strength. Over tens of thousands of miles, the steel piston rings scuffed the cylinder wall because the oil barrier wasn't strong enough to keep them separated, created microscopic scratches. And once a cylinder wall is scratched, the oil control ring loses its ability to scrape the oil back down into the pan. Thin oil slips past the rings, enters the combustion chamber, and burns up with the gasoline. I drained the 0W-20 and switched him to a robust 5W-30. The slightly heavier oil resisted the highway heat, stabilized the rings, and the consumption dropped dramatically. But the damage to the cylinder wall was already done. He will never get factory compression back without a full rebuild. He permanently cut years off his motor by trusting a generic recommendation printed on a plastic cap. I used to believe in following the manual blindly too, until I started tearing down engines and seeing the pattern. Does your car drink oil between changes? Don't lie to yourself. I know a lot of you are carrying a spare quart in the trunk right now. Tell me in the comments the year, the make, and the mileage on the odometer. I guarantee you we're going to see a pattern of guys running factory thin oil losing a quart every couple thousand miles. But there's another side to this story. Because thick oil charges a price too. You don't get maximum protection for free. Physics won't allow it. When you take a block that was designed for water weight oil and you dump heavier fluid into the pan, you introduce parasitic drag. The thick oil creates internal resistance. The crankshaft has to push against a viscous liquid on every rotation. The pump has to work harder to send it up to the head. All that resistance steals kinetic energy from the engine. What does that mean for you behind the wheel? It means you take a visible hit at the pump. You might lose half a mile per gallon, maybe a full mile if you drive a lot of city. You might notice the engine feels a little lazy when you stomp on the gas to pass. Throttle response won't be as sharp because the rotating assembly is fighting the thicker fluid in the bearings. You're staring at the central dilemma of motor oil. Maximum efficiency fights with maximum protection. You can't have both at the same time, but the math changes when the vehicle gets old. Let me tell you about Marcos. Brought an old SUV into my shop a few months back. 160,000 miles on the odometer. Marcos was old school. Read the manual the day he bought the truck new, saw the recommendation for thin oil, and never deviated. Used the same watery fluid for a decade straight because he swore the engine always ran smooth. At 160,000, things weren't running smooth. He came into my bay complaining about three things. At a long red light, the oil pressure gauge would sink toward the danger zone. On hard acceleration, the engine had a metallic knock. And worst of all, he was dumping a quart of makeup oil into the crankcase every 3 weeks just to keep the dipstick wet. Marcos was convinced he'd lost the engine. He was sitting in my waiting room pricing junkyard motors on his phone. I told him to put the credit card away. We put the truck on the lift, drained the watery oil he'd been stubbornly running, and dumped in a high-mileage 5W-40. The result was instant. He fired it up and the oil pressure shot back to factory spec at hot idle. The metallic knock in the valve train disappeared. Over the next month, oil consumption stabilized. Why did this fix a truck that looked ready for the scrapyard? Because Marcos didn't understand that an old engine physically changes shape. As it racks up miles, the metal naturally wears. The microscopic clearances between the steel crankshaft and the aluminum bearings widen. The gaps get bigger. Think of your oil system like a garden hose. If you put your thumb on the end to restrict the flow, the water pressure spikes. The stream shoots across the yard. That's a new engine with tight clearances. But when the engine wears, it's like taking your thumb off the hose. The restriction drops. The pressure drops with it. If you keep running watery oil in a 160,000-mile engine, that thin fluid bleeds out of the widened gaps too fast. The pump can't maintain pressure to keep the metal separated. Switching to heavier oil filled those widened gaps, restored the film that his worn engine needed just to keep living. But here's where guys take this knowledge and destroy their own cars. Before you go swapping viscosity grades in your driveway this weekend, you need to understand when thick oil is forbidden. You can't just dump 5W-40 diesel oil into a modern commuter and expect it to turn into an armored tank. Modern engines don't use oil only as a lubricant. They use it as a pressurized hydraulic fluid. Almost every car rolling off the lot today has variable valve timing. The ECU pulses oil pressure into sensitive hydraulic phasers to advance or retard the cam timing in real time. If you fill that engine with syrup, the phasers respond sluggishly. The oil can't push the mechanism fast enough. The computer gets confused, the dash lights up with cam timing codes, and the car drops into limp mode. And there's the thermometer outside your house. If you live in Minnesota or Alaska and the car sleeps outside at 15 below, thick oil is suicide. The cold amplifies viscosity. You'll starve the valve train on every cold start and snap a camshaft in half. You match the fluid to the physical reality of your environment, not to what some guy on the internet said. Engine oil has one job: create an unbreakable film between rotating metal. If it's too thin, the film collapses in heat. If it's too thick, it doesn't get there fast enough on a cold start. The ideal oil is the one that balances those two extremes for the way you actually drive your car. After tearing down the 3 motors and looking at the scarred bearings, the truth was clear. There's no universal best oil, but there is a best balance. If you do short grocery runs in winter or you're obsessed with squeezing every penny at the pump, the 0W-20 is your fluid. Flows on time, saves gas. If you're towing a trailer up a mountain or trying to stretch one more year out of a tired motor, the 5W-40 is a lifesaver. Doesn't break under stress. But the 5W-30 was the golden middle ground. It was the most consistently protective fluid across every category in the test. Didn't dominate the cold start. Wasn't the thickest armor in extreme heat. But it refused to fail in either situation. It adapted, gave a safe margin that protected the metal in every realistic daily scenario. Now, what I promised you at the beginning. The oil that kills more engines than any other. It's not the thin one. It's not the thick one. It's the old one. It's the oil you've been running for 15,000 miles because you assumed synthetic lasts forever. It's the oil that sat in the pan for 18 months because the car lives in the garage and you only drive on weekends. That oil has already oxidized. It's already sheared. The detergent additives are exhausted. The antioxidants are gone. The acidic byproducts of combustion have built up. The corrosion inhibitors are spent. What's inside the block isn't oil anymore. It's a dark liquid that pours, but it doesn't protect. Here's how that progression actually happens. Day 1 out of the bottle, synthetic oil has a full additive package engineered to last a certain mileage interval. Detergents to keep the engine clean. Anti-wear compounds like zinc and phosphorus that bond chemically to the metal under pressure. Anti-foaming agents. Viscosity modifiers that keep the oil stable across a temperature range. All of that is consumed during normal operation. There, one put braided ram. The envlopenless braided ram dumi. By 5,000 miles, the detergents are working hard to suspend combustion byproducts. By 8,000, the anti-wear additives are noticeably depleted. By 12,000, the viscosity modifiers are sheared down so far that your 5W-30 is acting like a thin 5W-20. And by 15,000, in a normal commuter that mixes city and highway, that oil has crossed into degraded territory. It's not protecting your engine anymore. It's just keeping the inside of the block wet. And here's the cruel part. The oil looks the same. You pull the dipstick, it comes out dark, which it would after 1,000 miles anyway because that's what detergent oil does. You rub it between your fingers and it feels slick. You can't see additive depletion. You can't see acid buildup. You can't see the moisture that condensed inside the crankcase from short trips that never let the oil reach full operating temperature long enough to boil it off. The fluid looks fine. It isn't fine. I tore down a motor about a year ago that the owner swore he'd babied. Always used premium synthetic. Always followed the manufacturer's recommendation. The manufacturer said 10,000-mile intervals. He stretched it to 12, sometimes 13, because the dash never told him to stop. The motor seized at 140,000 miles. When I pulled the head off, the cam journals were galled. The bearings were copper-colored, which means the protective layer was gone, and the next layer down was exposed. The oil I drained out smelled burnt and had the consistency of weak coffee. That engine wasn't killed by the wrong viscosity. It was killed by the right viscosity left in too long. I've seen more engines die from stretched oil change intervals than from wrong weight, by a wide margin, because wrong viscosity degrades slowly. Expired oil degrades right now, and there's a specific type of driver that gets hit by this harder than anyone else. The low-mileage driver. The retiree who drives 4 miles to the grocery store twice a week. The work-from-home professional who puts maybe 3,000 miles a year on the car. They look at the odometer and figure if the manufacturer says 10,000 miles, they've got 2.5 years before they need to think about oil. That's wrong. That's catastrophically wrong, because oil ages by time and by use. Their oil is sitting in the pan slowly oxidizing, slowly absorbing moisture, slowly acidifying, while they congratulate themselves on saving money on services. Every modern manufacturer specifies either a mileage interval or a time interval, whichever comes first. Most owners forget the second half of that sentence exists. The same thing happens to seasonal vehicles. The convertible that hibernates from October to April. The pickup that only comes out when there's snow to plow. The motorcycle that lives under a cover from Thanksgiving to Easter. The owners assume that because the engine wasn't running, the oil didn't degrade. It did. It absorbed humidity from the air inside the crankcase. It separated. The additives settled. When you finally fire it up in spring, you're running on something that chemically isn't what you put in there last fall. Here's what I tell every customer who walks into my bay. If you do mostly highway driving in mild weather, you can probably stretch toward the manufacturer recommendation, maybe 7,000 to 9,000 miles on a good synthetic. If you do mostly short trips in extreme weather, hot or cold, cut that interval in half. If you tow, cut it in half again. If the car sits more than it drives, change it on time anyway, even if you've only put 2,000 miles on it. If you're choosing oil only by the number on the plastic cap, you're trusting a factory recommendation recommendation calibrated to pass a federal emissions test. But if you're choosing it by the way you actually press the gas pedal, by the climate outside your windshield, by the mileage on the dash, and you change it when it actually needs to be changed, you're protecting the engine for the time it deserves. Wrong oil in the crankcase almost never explodes the block in an afternoon. It's worse than that. It just guarantees that the motor never reaches where it could have reached.